Good evening, the date is 30th of January 2016 and welcome to the Free Life Podcast. Today we've had some very depressing news. I usually watch Sky News in the effort of abstaining from consuming the BBC. But today Sky News has just been absolutely appalling. In its description, in the language it is used in describing the news that that Facebook has now banned the sale of second-hand or any kind of firearms, so far as I can tell, on its website and via its subsidiary company Instagram. Obviously, in an attempt to stop people being able to defend themselves. It's quite obvious. Facebook is in bed with the state with a capital S, and so depressing was the coverage that it got on Sky News. I felt I had to release a podcast about this. The language being used was, the narrative was, the gun lobby are trying to oppose this. It's only the gun lobby, i.e. people who want to sell guns and make money from guns, who want to protect your right to defend yourself, whereas everyone who's on the side of progress with a capital P, people like Hillary Clinton, people like Barack Obama, and of course they had to show that awful footage of him crying on television, very statesmanlike, about the people in Chicago, I think. They're on the side of progress. They're the people who want to keep us safe from guns. And of course this wonderful statistic which you can bandy about, 300 million guns in America, which are more guns than there are people. It's irrelevant. That is irrelevant. It's about who has guns, and it's about where the shootings take place. The shootings take place generally in gun-free zones, places where there aren't guns, where if you have a gun, you are therefore at an advantage over the people who don't have guns. It's very, very simple. If you have a gun, and the person trying to shoot you also has a gun, you're fairly equal, provided you can use a gun. But of course, no one understands this, least of all the electorate, and so all of these kinds of proposals, if they're ever put to a vote in any state, you're going to get something like gun control almost everywhere. But Sky News was very pro-gun control in a way that I just didn't expect, but it's making me sort of sceptical about how much the quality of our broadcast media will improve if we just shut down the BBC. You know, the BBC is awful, but occasionally it's quite impartial. And I usually watch Russia Today and Sky News. If I do watch the news, I usually just listen to it. But today they've been absolutely awful on both of them have been awful on this subject, particularly Sky News though. But this ties in obviously with a more important, with a broader issue. The state does not want you to be able to defend yourself. The state does not want the people rising up, opposing, in particular at the moment, the disastrous and nation-destroying experiment of mass immigration. And we've seen this also today with the National Front protests in Dover, in Kent. Lots of people turned up for a National Front thing. I didn't think there were that many people in the National Front anymore. I thought they'd more or less gone the way of the BNP. But a lot of people turned up, and there was some kind of fallout. And of course, again, the way this is reported, it's ostensibly reported in the broadcast media as impartial, i.e. people turned up to oppose mass immigration, and there was a bit of a fight at the end. But really, the way it's told is people turned up to oppose government policy, and they lost. People turned up to oppose a government policy which will finally, after at least a quarter of a century of state attempts at the destruction of the English nation, a policy which will finally bring this about. People turn up to oppose this. And do you know what? They made no impact at all. And anyone who's watching, you will also have no impact if you try to resist. The state doesn't want you to oppose them. The state doesn't want any opposition, and it doesn't want any pretense of opposition by the way of effective protests. It reminds me, this theme of self-protection, it also reminds me of earlier in the week. There was some news item about women in particular in Germany after the sex attacks, which we're now hearing were absolutely far worse than originally we feared was the case. Something like 100 women, I think, were attacked in Cologne. But following this, there has been at least a 100% increase in the demand for the services of particularly effective self-defense classes. The kind of self-defense classes that the Israeli Defense Force or the Israeli people, I assume, actually, make use of. And this is quite frightening as well. If people in Germany, a supposedly first world country, a supposedly civilized country, if women in Germany are having to resort to the kind of self-defense tactics and the self-defense classes that people in Israel have to resort to, whether or not you support Israel or Palestine, it's undeniable that both parties are under a constant threat, though perhaps one side more than the other, but I won't go into that. But if people in Germany are that afraid for their life, then we are in trouble. But, of course, the state is trying to implement some crisis management strategies, some strategies to try to limit the destructive impact of this recent wave of people from less developed countries, let's say. It reminds me of the leaflets, I think. I think they're leaflets, or perhaps they were fully fledged guidebooks or manuals handed out to these migrants, telling them how to become good citizens of Germany. And the kinds of things that were in these manuals or these posters or these leaflets are just so depressing. There was, for instance, one, I think this was a poster, but I may be wrong, one instruction to the migrants that said, "In Germany, we do not masturbate in the public baths." Another was, "In Germany, we treat women with respect." In Germany, homosexuals can display their sexuality in public without fear of attack. The list goes on, and they're all fairly similar in their in how basic they are. But we always forget when we engage in mass immigration like this from countries like Syria, for instance. We forget that these people do not take these sorts of norms for granted in the way that we do. But, like I said, that manual or those posters did just really bring it home to me, just how much trouble we are in. And of course, there is always one thing which is to blame at the moment: Islam. Islam is the scapegoat at the moment, which is really quite interesting, because for years during the mass immigration experiment, let's call it, Islam was given a fairly positive reception from the aforementioned broadcast media. But of late, Islam has been getting a very bad press. A very bad press indeed. And, this is from the political class and from the media and so on and so forth. And why do they want us to pin all of the blame for the savagery, for the crime, for the resentment, and for the terrorism? Why do they want us to pin all of the blame for this on Islam? I have no answer to that. It may simply be that... Oh, and I have to just mention that almost everyone on the right has fallen for this as well. Almost everyone on the right thinks that they're saying something profound and something intelligent and something meaningful when they say, oh, we have a problem with radical Islam. Everyone on the right, from Donald Trump to people in the British right, seem to think that that's a clever thing to say, and it makes them edgy, and it makes them conservative, or it makes them somehow critical of the policies of the present ruling class. Well, no, it doesn't. You're playing into their hands. But it may just be that the state has run out of things that that we can't say in order to give us an explanation for what's going wrong. It may just be that the state is reluctant to let us be a bit racist, and so has decided to let us be anti-Islam for a bit. I don't know, but Islam is certainly not the problem. I remember not long ago watching an interview with the great Peter Oborne being interviewed by, of all people, Owen Jones, which was interesting. Owen Jones, the appalling... perhaps I'm being unfair, because he is, on his YouTube channel, being more and more open-minded, as many people on the far left are becoming. So yes, I do take that back, actually. People on the left and people on the real left and people on the real right are starting to put aside their differences, and I suppose I should put my differences aside with people like Owen Jones. I should put aside my differences with him if he's going to talk to people like Peter Oborne. But Peter Oborne was saying that the political class have, in order to suit their own ends, created this false narrative about Islam. That the only good Muslims are those who are secular, and who do not, who are essentially non-Muslim. The only good Muslims are the Muslims who give up their faith. But, in any case, Islam is not the problem. Indeed, I was talking not long ago to the person who runs Pegida Finland, the Finnish wing of the, I think, originally German anti-immigration group. And in Finland, while in most of Europe and certainly the new Pegida UK, while most of these groups are so anti-Islam that it's ridiculous, the group in Finland is not. Finland has had Muslims living there peacefully, productively and happily for about 150 years. They've caused no problems. And the Finnish group makes this clear in their anti-immigration rallies and protests. That's interesting, isn't it? And so that's the kind of anti-immigration protest that I would be happy to see in England. But we're not seeing it. We're seeing only anti-Islam protests. But anyway, that's why Donald Trump's immigration policy is just so ridiculous. Any potential, any potentially good things he might say about immigration from the South, immigration of violent criminal Mexicans, it is just outweighed by the stupidity of the other part of his immigration policy. But even so, when it comes to immigration from the South, he's probably not as strong on that as Ted Cruz and Rand Paul. But even so, he'll probably get the nomination, and it'll be him or Hillary. And, well, I don't know, I think probably Donald Trump will be better than Hillary. Even so, we have a problem. We have a problem with immigration, and we have a problem with self-defence, and the problem is becoming more linked than ever. And unless we make this clear, then the state will get away with it. It may get to a point where, in a number of places in the United Kingdom, women are having to take self-defence classes of the kind used by the Israelis. And I don't know about you, perhaps I'm alone among libertarians in not wanting to live in an England that resembles, that resembles the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. I don't know, perhaps it is just me, because a lot of libertarians seem to find no problems at all with immigration, of whatever kind of people, and in however large numbers. So maybe I'm a racist, maybe I'm not a libertarian. I'll leave that up to you, but what is undeniable is that I want to live in a safe country, and I want to live in an England that looks like England. But the question of my own selfish desire, let's say, to live in an English England leads me to discuss an exchange I had not long ago about whether a libertarian can be a patriot. And to some extent I think that the terminology over this matter is just so confused and so frustrating of any kind of serious discussion of it. The terms nationalist and patriot are sometimes used synonymously, but sometimes they mean radically different things, and sometimes they mean some variant of the other, with very slight, very nuanced differences. I have my own understandings of the terms, and they may well be wrong, but the terms essentially are not that important. What I mean by the two terms that I'm going to use is more important. So, patriotism to me is about being a, quote, good citizen, i.e. doing the state's bidding, doing what the state wants you to do, being a subservient citizen of a state. But this is often confused. The word patriotism is often meant to mean nationalism, the proper meaning of nationalism, which is a love or an appreciation or even an understanding of your own people, your own history, your own religion, your own ethnicity, your own culture, and your own land. Sadly, but of course deliberately on the part of the political class, nationalism is nowadays equated with Nazism or fascism, when it's in fact the very opposite. Nazism and fascism were statist ideologies. Libertarians can believe in the concept of the nation. They can believe in the concept of a group of people coming together based on common ties of blood, belief, appearance, or other identities. And the stronger this feeling of a common endeavour, whether based on blood, soil, or ideas, and the more organic and historically rooted it is, the weaker the state. The state cannot count on weak individuals. The state cannot hurt you if you support and are supported by the nation. Therefore, the state has set out particularly since the third quarter of the 20th century, to destroy the nation and nationalism and replace it with the idea of the state and patriotism. This change in attitudes has coincided with the rise of a political class and the destruction of the old British establishment. Therefore, everything is no longer about being English, but about being British. Britain being the state in which we live, and England being our nation. Well, my nation anyway. You might be Scottish or Welsh or Irish. Everything is therefore no longer about the specific virtues of Englishness, but about the generic and meaningless and universal values of citizenship. And so is it any wonder that as citizenship is defined by the state and is fed from a young age to children at school in what were known in my day anyway as PSHCE lessons? I think they're probably changed because schooling, as I've so recently found out, has changed massively. Primary and secondary schooling has changed so much since when I last received it. But the state, through these citizenship lessons, let's call them, tells you that being a good citizen is doing what the state tells you to do. And is it any wonder? I would say no. So, if a patriot, means being someone who accepts this rubbish, then a libertarian can't be a patriot. But a libertarian can be a nationalist, in the proper sense of the term. But, of course, there is this term nation-state. Where does the term nation-state come from? And I think the term nation-state really came into its own in the 19th century with the rise of the nation-state, meaning literally a state for every distinct nation. But it can be seen in two different lights, I think. You can see the rise of the nation-state as, to some extent, a regression when it came about, but you can see the loss of the nation-state also as a bad thing. Let me explain. Well, perhaps the rise of the nation-state in the mid-19th century was to some extent a neutral development. In some ways it had a positive impact for liberty and property with the breakup of some larger empires into their constituent groups of similar peoples, but in some ways it did lead to the centralisation, notably with the classic example of the state of Prussia for the German nation, replacing smaller states after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. But this was perhaps overall the opposite of progress. Perhaps overall this was bad because it was a movement away from the idea of a state being something which was defined by the royal domain. It was a movement away of the idea of the state constrained by the quote property owned by the monarch. But the idea of the nation, the idea of the nation state was certainly done away with the Great War. After the Great War, with the victors creating these utterly asinine new states, like Yugoslavia in 1918. Yugoslavia contained the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Serbs, which was a recipe for disaster, and we saw that. They had to be broken up. The same can be seen also with the state of Czechoslovakia later, which had to have its velvet divorce to prevent similar tensions. So what I'm saying is this. Before the mid-19th century, there were some states which were even smaller than the nation, constrained by, how big the amount of land the monarch had was. Particularly so with the many small states in what is now modern Germany. There was less centralisation. With the rise of the idea of the nation-state came a state for every nation, which in some ways was bad, in some ways was good, in terms of centralisation anyway. However, the 20th century was the age of the destruction of the nation-state. It was certainly the idea of a state based on the size of the royal domain was gone by then, with the 20th century also being the age of democracy. But there was also a move from the away from the mid 19th century idea of a state for every nation, and towards clumsy state building. The effects of World War II and Soviet communism are still being felt to this day, with a number of state borders having been drawn up in a very stupid fashion. But essentially, compared to the present day big centralised states, and also factoring in the anti-nationalism of the European Union and the global institutions as well, the idea of the nation-state is something that serves as a useful idea. The idea of the nation, and therefore of the nation-state, is something which now can be used to restrain the state, if we use it. But the idea of the nation-state relies on the idea of the nation, and it relies on the idea of promoting your own people. It relies on the idea of discrimination. It relies on it relies on the people of this country getting to know themselves once again, becoming self-conscious, and wising up on their history and their culture. But of course, we shouldn't stop there. Once we get nation-states back, we have to go further towards the ultimate aim of the breakup of the state itself. But that's a long way away if every single state becomes a completely heterogeneous mess, a completely nationless. If we end up with a completely nationless world, because every person in every state will be universally weak against an omnipresent state. Anyway, I've been racist, and I've been I've engaged in too much thought crime for one day, so I'll leave you there. Thank you for listening.